Ever noticed that sometimes Christian ministers and lay leaders can go completely off the rails? I don't mean they commit sexual indiscretions or argue badly with parishioners, though of course, being human, they sometimes do those and much more besides. None of which is particularly good news for the church, let alone wider society. But it's understandable. No, what I'm referring to is a kind of spiritual arrogance, which assumes because one has power in a position in an institution like the church, it automatically includes moral authority, being right. It's not so much that God is on their side, but rather might or power is on their side. Now, I've seen this often enough in my career as a minister. It's a kind of institutional bullying. Naturally, it's destructive and it does harm. It's a systemic problem within the church, and Jesus identified it as such. Think of the parable of the two men who went to the temple to pray. The one asked for mercy, while the other, a leader with that kind of authority, said, "Thank God I'm not like that wretch over there." Being a systemic problem, it happens across institutions, religions, and down the centuries too. In our own time, the Taliban and Islamic State have dedicated themselves to taking out knowledge, wisdom, and culture. The Taliban destroyed the ancient Buddhist sculptures because it offended their sense of what they thought God demanded. Now, surely Christian leaders today couldn't be as obnoxious and thick as that. Alas, I suspect we could all too easily quote chapter and verse, even today. But one occasion stands out from early colonial Dunedin in New Zealand. First, the YMCA got divided, then the city itself. It was all about who controls what information and how they exerted power. Now, we've talked about Reverend A.R. Fitchett previously. In 1876, Fitchett published a small booklet, The Ethics of Evolution. It was favourable to Darwin's theory of evolution and it was against the literal interpretation of Genesis. But just before the publication came out, the board of the Dunedin Young Men's Christian Association, the Y, had invited Fitchett to be on the board. When two of the governors of the Y either heard about or actually read The Ethics of Evolution, they were angered and concluded his views were contrary to the Word of God. They argued that he wasn't fit to be a board member. Now, Fitchett had heard about their complaints but felt it was his civic duty to let his name go forward. He was certainly never the man to avoid a good stoush if it meant standing up for the truth as he perceived it, just as his opponents were. At the next board meeting, a vote was taken. Only the original two were against him. However, under the constitutional rules, this was enough to stop his nomination. Interestingly, the same pair had tried to oust the sitting member of the board of the Y, the broad-minded congregational minister, Dr. Roseby. This had been done just a fraction previously, but that attempt had failed. Roseby was one of Dunedin's most influential ministers, prominent in civic affairs, a member of the University Council and a stimulating scholar. So that's what happened, and I found myself asking, what was it in Fitchett's booklet that had so offended the two governors? Now, Fitchett laid no claim to scientific expertise, but he tried to relate Darwin's theory of evolution to belief in God and belief in the biblical scheme of the fall and redemption. Two phrases particularly stand out in that booklet. First, Fitchett argued that evolution is, quote, continuous creation, unquote. And what he meant by that was that the universe is evolving towards more complex and richer organic life, and that existing organisms are similarly on the road upwards to higher perfection. Now, having gone up and down the ethics of evolution a number of times myself, I reached a conclusion. On balance, it seems as if Fitchett wanted a biological continuous creation to be understood as the natural theology for his day and age. The other notable thought in Fitchett's pamphlet is that evolution is rather like a continuous miracle, paraphrasing it. In his estimation, the problem of suffering seemed explicable within the new scientific framework proposed by Darwin in a way that wasn't previously possible. Thus he wrote, quote, "Evolution will help theology," unquote, to find convincing explanations to the problem of evil. Anyway, the Otago Daily Times heard what trouble had come down on Fitchett at the Y. In a brief paragraph, 14 October 1876, it called the result of the vote against Fitchett remarkable. By 17 October, the editor had marshalled his facts and analysed the situation thus. There was indeed a war between science and religion, and any attempt to reconcile the two was useless. Forced reconciliations were out of the question, and the editorial leader strongly urged the public to take sides in the debate. Unfortunately, in the long term, there were serious consequences for both Fitchett and the Presbyterian minister, Professor William Salmon, as a result of their highly publicised views. A special meeting for all the members of the Y was called in response to the editorial lampooning. Deep divisions soon became apparent. The feelings of those opposed to Fitchett may best be summarised in the words of Mr. Graham, who, apparently unaware, ignorant of the long history of the faith-science interaction, declared that, quote, "pulpits had been degraded by the introduction of scientific subjects," unquote. All that in 1876. But could it possibly happen again in our day and age? Of course it could. But in 1876, as I suggested earlier, no one was going to step back from the stoush. The Baptist minister, J. Upton Davis, quote, objected to the word degraded as applied to pulpits, unquote, as did a number of others. 3 cheers for the Baptists of that era. However, the opposition won the day. The special meeting of the Y voted against Fitchett being a member of the Board of Governors on the basis of what they construed the ethics of evolution to mean. Roseby, along with Dr. R. Borrow, tendered their immediate resignations, and Upton Davis, a short time later, followed suit. Borrow, a member of Fitchett's congregation, was a notable medical figure in early Dunedin. He was tragically killed in a horse and carriage accident the year after Fitchett resigned from Methodist ministry. The Otago Daily Times was outraged by the turn of events at the Y. The editorial highlighted the inhumane things that had been done in the past in the name of religion. In a vitriolic attack, it was suggested that 3 centuries previously, the young Christians of Dunedin would, without doubt, have burned Fitchett at the stake for his alleged heresy. In an earlier age than that, they would have stoned him to death. But, constrained by a more civilised society, they could but, quote, blackball, unquote. Though, of course, their natural inclination was to do much worse. The newspaper then exhorted Fitchett not to be worried by this miserable outrage, for the majority of Christians took his view and would, quote, regret the injury done to religion, unquote. So the city itself was divided by the troubles at the Y, polarised around the Siamese twins of creative theology joined at the hip of Darwin's evolution and biblical criticism. Next week, we'll see what part Professor Salmon had played in this. And thanks for watching.